Hi, good morning. Not a very big crowd, maybe more focused discussion, I guess. Thank you all for coming. Normally, David doesn't really need a introduction. He's been to ISS a couple of times. Um, at the moment, David is a distinguished research fellow at the Australia India Institute in Melbourne, and he's also a visiting fellow as the Strategy and Defense Studies Center, ANU. David, of course, has written extensively on the Indo-Pacific, the Bay of Bengal, and I said before, he's come here before. He's written a book on the Bay of Bengal. So I don't want to take too much of time. I just let David start. There's a small audience. Let's take advantage of it in the Q&A. We can have a slightly more focused discussion. So I think I leave the floor to David. David, all yours.
Thanks very much, Cinder, and it's great being back. I always love visiting Singapore and ISAS. So today I'm going to talk about how some fundamental power shifts in the Indo-Pacific are going to give the Bay of Bengal area a much greater strategic significance, and that's for a number of reasons that I'll go through. Basically, this talk is really the next, building on a previous talk I gave here a year or so ago about trying to reconceptualize the Bay of Bengal as a single strategic space, rather than drawing a line down the middle of it, one side being South Asia and the other side being Southeast Asia. And that's really the way much of the world has operated since around 1945 or so. And I argue that division, while still having some importance, is losing its relevance, and we have to have a better vision of the Bay of Bengal of a space with its own strategic dynamics. And so that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, what these strategic dynamics are, and how they, in my view, they're going to give this area much greater strategic significance than it had in the past. Now, these trends don't necessarily all work in the same direction. They sort of sometimes come up against each other. But that very process, I think, potentially gives the area greater instability, or at least potential for significant competition. So first of all, I'll talk about some merging of the strategic dynamics of the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions as really encompassed in this new idea of the Indo-Pacific, and how the Bay of Bengal really is a space that sits close to the centre of the Indo-Pacific, whereas previously it was a space that was on the periphery of consideration. Secondly, the relatively bright economic prospects of a number of Bay of Bengal states and how that impacts on the entire Indo-Pacific. Third, growing strategic competition between China, India and Japan in the region, which is currently focused on infrastructure development but has the potential to move beyond that. And fourth, some other intra-regional dynamics, and in particular I wanted to focus on growing Buddhist-Muslim conflicts or disputes and what that means. So, let's have a look. Yes, so that's the four things I wanted to talk about. So here we are, the Indo-Pacific. There's still debate about exactly how you define it and what it means, but I'm not really going to go into that, other than to note that the Bay of Bengal, to the extent that the Indo-Pacific has meaning in terms of the greater connections, economic and strategic connections between East Asia and South Asia, or the Indian Ocean, then the Bay of Bengal acts as a key physical an economic connector between those regions. And one could argue that the concept of the Indo-Pacific gives a strategic centrality towards a new strategic complex, which you could define as the South China Sea, the Malacca Strait, plus the Bay of Bengal. And this reflects the expansion, China's interests westwards into the Indian Ocean, expansion of India's interests eastwards into the Pacific, the importance of the littoral states in that mix, and maritime communications. So there's another picture of the strategic centrality, I suppose, of these three pieces: the South China Sea, the Malacca Strait, and the Bay of Bengal. Oops. So let me talk about the second piece, which is the economic changes we're now seeing in the Bay of Bengal area. And the key takeaway here is the relatively bright economic prospects of India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Myanmar, which are giving these countries a much greater importance to Asia and indeed the whole world. Now, these three countries essentially missed out on the economic booms of the East Asian tigers we saw in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Really, that East Asian boom really didn't go any further west than Thailand. And now these countries are experiencing or projected to have economic growth rates which exceed most countries in East Asia. So these numbers are probably a little bit old now, but economic growth in 2015 is projected to be 6.4% for Bangladesh, 7.5% for Sri Lanka, 8% for Myanmar, and 7 to 8% for India. So some are now talking about the potential for the rise of what's called, what some are calling the Bengal tigers. So much of this projected growth, particularly in the smaller Bay of Bengal states, is based around their potential for low-cost export manufacturing. And while the growth prospects in many of these countries remain fragile for a number of reasons, it's possible over the next decade that we could see these countries experience breakout growth in manufacturing exports, similar to that experienced by the core ASEAN states in previous decades. The development of a major energy industry in the Bay of Bengal could also provide an important underpinning for some of this economic development. The Bay of Bengal is believed to have significant gas reserves, which, although largely unexplored and undeveloped, are believed to be the largest gas reserves in Asia. And the recent resolution of maritime boundary disputes between India, Bangladesh and Myanmar really opens the door for this exploration and exploitation of these energy reserves. So the third area is the growing strategic competition we are seeing in the area between China, India and Japan. And this is really focused or triggered by a relatively low level of regional economic integration among the states in the Bay of Bengal, and a great dearth of infrastructure, especially transport connections within the states in the Bay of Bengal and between them and with the rest of the world. To a significant extent, you could say that countries, particularly like countries like Myanmar, also Bangladesh to a significant extent, were largely cut off from there in terms of transport connections to the rest of the world. So they have got a long way to go in terms of developing them. One Bangladeshi government official talks about the economic concavity of the Bay of Bengal. The Bay of Bengal is geographically concave, but he argues that in the past it has been economically concave as well, so that the world trade has essentially passed the Bay of Bengal by. And you can see, just in terms of these shipping routes, the red routes being the most active, the yellow ones less active, you can see that the shipping routes virtually completely bypass the Bay of Bengal. So the dearth of this infrastructure which aids interconnectivity in the Bay of Bengal has really triggered external involvement in terms of building infrastructure, that including ports, railways, roads, power stations, etc., pipelines. And at the same time, the efforts by countries like China and others to build infrastructure has triggered a new area of strategic competition between India and China. And in some ways, the Bay of Bengal area has become possibly or probably the key region of overt strategic competition between India and China, and I'll get onto that in a minute. So China's growing role in the region has probably been the single most important factor in terms of growing strategic competition. China is currently sponsoring the development of overland connections between southern China, Yunnan province, and the Bay of Bengal as part of its bridgehead, what it calls the bridgehead strategy of turning Yunnan province into the gateway for China's economic engagement with the Indian Ocean. And so there are some in China that talk about China becoming a two-ocean state, Pacific and Indian Ocean, and the key connections to the Indian Ocean would be through Yunnan province, and to a lesser extent through Xinjiang province as well. So that calls for the development of new transport routes mostly across Myanmar, which includes in recent times the development of pipelines from Myanmar to Kyaukphyu on the Myanmar coast, and also plans for the what's called the BCIM economic corridor, which is the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar economic corridor. So that would be an economic corridor running from Kunming across Myanmar, then across India's northeast states, then across Bangladesh, essentially terminating at Kolkata. Now, this is a massive and highly ambitious enterprise which is intended to really build an eco-structure, I suppose, of manufacturing industries across that corridor, all feeding with the intention, really, at least from the Chinese side, of feeding back into into China. The Indians are quite cautious about the whole concept for a number of reasons. One of them being concerns about the impact of economically connecting India's northeast states to China without those states first properly being economically integrated with mainland India. So that's a major concern from their standpoint. There's also a number of, I suppose, military-related concerns of building too many roads across this region that would potentially connect China with India, that could be used by China against India. There's also a vast number of problems in terms of negotiating transit rights right across these countries. You have to get 4 countries to agree to these transit rights, and we know in that part of the world it's hard enough to get 2 countries to agree to transit rights, let alone 4. So that's an ambitious project, but and it's probably in reality currently on hold at the moment, but nevertheless China is still pushing a number of overland connections between Yunnan and the Bay of Bengal. Beijing is also, of course, undertaking the Maritime Silk Route initiative, which is designed to connect. It's essentially the oceanic complement to the various overland silk routes. And what it is still really a question mark in a number of people's minds, but I suppose at least the best explanation I could give is that it's intended to be a system of linked ports and special economic zones sprinkled across Southeast Asia and the northern Indian Ocean, with the intention to develop production and distribution chains across the region with China at its centre. So I suppose, in my mind at least, you could look at it as China's flying geese strategy, if you like. The flying geese strategy being Japan's strategy from around the 1970s, when it realised that rising production costs in Japan would force it to push production into a series of low-cost production zones in East Asia and Southeast Asia, again, all feeding back to Japan at the centre of those production chains. So to my mind, the Maritime Silk Route could be looked at as a sort of a flying geese strategy. More prosaically, you could also look at it as just as an excuse for China to be spending a lot of money on its infrastructure companies, Chinese infrastructure companies that are struggling in the domestic market, so create new markets for it, for Chinese concrete overseas, if you like. But in broader strategic terms, you could see these Chinese moves as really an attempt, important historical attempt to break the constraints which have historically kept China virtually completely isolated from the Indian Ocean. The Himalayas and the jungles along the southern Asian rim have really cut China off from any meaningful links into the Indian Ocean throughout much of history, and this is, if you look at it in broad terms, an attempt for China to reach towards the Indian Ocean largely through the Bay of Bengal, not exclusively. So India, where is India in the Bay of Bengal? Well, obviously it's long aspired to be recognised as the prominent military power in the Bay of Bengal. It's long been suspicious of any Chinese presence, and indeed any extra-regional presence in the Bay of Bengal, including the United States, and that was obviously manifested in the Indian reaction to the USS Enterprise in 1971, but it continues to this day. So although India has, I suppose, grudgingly accepted US predominance in the Indian Ocean as a whole, there's still a feeling that it would be best if the United States be largely kept out of the Bay of Bengal as much as possible. But putting the US aside, the key focus of India now is obviously China, and we've seen significant jostling for influence between India and China in countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Most recently, obviously, this year in Sri Lanka with the ejection of the Rajapaksa regime in January. It's not entirely clear what role New Delhi had in the January election. I think it's clear that at least it played a material role in pulling together the various disparate Tamil parties in Sri Lanka to oppose Rajapaksa, and really one of the key concerns from New Delhi's standpoint was a perception of growing Chinese military and economic influence in Sri Lanka. So that's been the key focus, I suppose, or the key manifestation of India-China strategic competition in the Bay of Bengal. But we're seeing, significant degree of competition, perhaps at a lower level, also in Bangladesh and Myanmar. So India, in economic terms, India is trying to play a much more active role in the region, and in terms of connecting the Bay of Bengal to the Indian economy, and also using the Bay of Bengal as a connector between India and Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, India's deep institutional constraints, I suppose you could say, has slowed its efforts and made it, given it much less influence than could otherwise have been the case. A couple of initiatives I'll mention one is the Trilateral Highway project, which is intended to connect India's northeast through Myanmar to Thailand, and onwards to the rest of Southeast Asia. And you could see this more or less in terms of east-west connections being promoted by India, as opposed to north-south connections being promoted by China. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, institutional constraints mean that India is very slow off the mark, and the projects such as these are relatively small when you compare them with China. And I think the Trilateral Highway project has probably been on the drawing board for maybe 15 years or so, and it's only in recent months that I think it's even opened, and I'm not quite sure. I don't think it's even properly opened because the various transit rights hadn't been properly negotiated between India and Myanmar. So there's a much greater focus, or growing focus, I suppose, on the Indian side to renewing shipping connections across the bay. So up until the 1940s, Calcutta was really a hub of quite a dense inter-regional shipping networks right across the bay, connecting India with the various territories, and also, importantly, making a lot of use of the rivers in the region to connect right up into the hinterland of what is now Bangladesh and also Myanmar, and which allowed Indian products and Indian people to connect deeply into the region. So these connections were virtually allowed to almost completely to wither away in the decades following decolonisation, and so we got to a stage where goods being shipped from, say, Rangoon to India either had to go via Singapore or via Mumbai. And then it would be transshipped, say, in Mumbai and then back to Kolkata. And that reflects a number of things. Firstly, the collapse of Kolkata as a regional hub for a whole host of reasons. And India's basic neglect of the region. It didn't see, it really, Nehru and his successors really didn't see India as taking up its predominance and position that it held during the colonial period. So there's an attempt to redevelop these shipping routes across the bay, but not using Kolkata, really based in and around Chennai instead. So Chennai would become India's new eastern shipping hub. Okay, so Japan is the other major player in the Bay of Bengal, not the United States. This is for a number of reasons, one of which being the global financial crisis sort of damaged US ability to make major external investments. But also Japan has a particular interest in the Bay of Bengal in terms of it being the connector, if you like, between the economic connector between East Asia and Southeast Asia. So I'm sorry, I don't have the slides here, but so Japan are developing economic corridors right across the Indochina, with the intention of connecting to the east coast of India and also to Bangladesh and Myanmar. And in this sort of plan, if you can call it that, the Bay of Bengal states, the smaller Bay of Bengal states, play a role of being physical connectors between East Asia and South Asia, but also economic connectors in the sense of being part of low-cost manufacturing production chains, which feed back to Japan. And there is a strong element of strategic competition between Japan and China in terms of developing these competing conceptions of production chains. The JICA, the Japanese International sorry, I forget the acronym. It's the Japanese Development Corporation, if you like, has been very active in pushing not only for the development of the economic corridor across Indochina, but also special economic zones in Myanmar, the southern economic corridor in India, and most recently what it calls the Big B project, which is the Bay of Bengal Industrial Growth Belt, connecting Bangladesh with the Bay of Bengal, and that's to develop an economic corridor running from Dhaka down to Chittagong, and then connecting to a Japanese-built port near Chittagong to ship product back to Japan. Now, the Japanese has had a fairly important win earlier this year when it was awarded the rights to develop a new port near Chittagong, and many see this as really effectively precluding Chinese-led plans to develop a new port in Sonadia. So it's a bit of a port race. And the the Japanese military, I suppose, if you like, or at least the Ministry of Defence, is taking a really increasing interest in the Bay of Bengal area, and including plans to provide military assistance, or what it calls capacity building, to a number of Bay of Bengal states. Okay, so that's the sort of strategic competition, if you like, with going on at a higher level between a number of extra-regional states. I'll just say a few words about some intra-regional dynamics, with particular focus on the Buddhist-Muslim divide. Now, the Bay of Bengal is also really the meeting place of at least three, arguably four great of the world's great religions: Hindu, Islam, and Buddhism. It's one of the most important concentrations of Buddhists in the world. There's about 120 million Buddhists in the region, concentrated in Buddhist majority states of Thailand, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka, and more than 500 million Muslims, mostly in Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. While we're used to seeing Hindu-Muslim frictions, I think, at least for most of the world, the concept of significant Buddhist-Muslim frictions is a fairly new idea. And I think, you know, or the signs are, or there's a chance that this will only grow in coming years, and may develop its own strategic dynamic, which also could bring in extra regional influences into the Bay of Bengal. So in Thailand, we've obviously seen the separatist violence in southern Thailand, which, although has been around for quite some time and has ebbed and flowed, it certainly appears to be on the upswing over the last couple of years, and particularly since the military junta has taken power in Thailand. They've taken a much harder line against the Muslim separatists in the south, and the separatists have responded with a step up in attacks. We've also seen, at least until recently, growing Buddhist-Muslim communal violence in Sri Lanka, and this was in the years after the defeat of the LTTE in 2009. A number of Buddhist Sinhalese ultra-nationalist groups turned their attentions towards the significant Muslim minorities in the eastern provinces of Sri Lanka, claiming that the Muslims minorities in those provinces were coming under the influence of Saudi religious groups. And we saw one of Sri Lanka's most influential Buddhist groups, the BBS, calling for various laws to suppress or restrict the growth of Islam in Sri Lanka. You know, interestingly, there's some quite close links between BBS and various Buddhist nationalist groups in Myanmar as well. And also, interestingly, some links between them and Hindu nationalist groups in India. Now, as far as I'm aware, these frictions, or at least overt violence, has fallen since the ouster of the Rajapaksa regime in January. But I think it certainly has the potential to reassert itself. So the epicenter of Muslim Buddhist friction is now in Myanmar, essentially around the Rohingyas, although not exclusively. Um, and the Myanmar government has been apparently just further tightening the control over the Rohingya population, including attempts to prevent intermarriage, land ownership, voting, or many other civil rights for them. And we've seen the outcome of that in an upsurge in refugees fleeing Rakhine State to Bangladesh, and also across the over the seas to Thailand and Myanmar. So while this is led by some fundamentalist groups such as the 969 movement in Myanmar, it doesn't appear that other Myanmar political groups, including Aung San Suu Kyi, has really made any efforts to prevent this or oppose these attacks on Muslims. So this is increasingly drawing in Bangladesh, obviously, for obvious reasons, but also we've seen during this year also Thailand and Malaysia, which have had to face very large numbers of refugees. And although they made initial attempts to push many of these refugees back into the sea, that's not really going to be a long-term solution to it. So where is this conflict going to lead? We've seen some attempts by groups such as Al-Qaeda and LET to create footholds within the Rohingyas. They have not apparently been terribly successful for reasons which are not clear. Some Bangladeshi analysts have claimed that it's simply because the Rohingyas have no real middle class, educated middle class, where these ideologies could take hold. That could possibly be a reason, but I'm sure there'll be further attempts to radicalise the Rohingyas. China has taken some interesting steps as well. The links that China is trying to build through Myanmar, many of them go through Rakhine State. So the current the pipelines between Yunnan Province and Kharkiv is in Rakhine State and has been the subject of a lot of communal violence between the Rohingyas and local Buddhist groups. The China, in recent months, has moved to develop direct links with Buddhist Rakhine nationalist groups in Rakhine State. So hedging their bets, if you like, if the central Myanmar government is unable to control the violence, they have other ways or other connections into Rakhine State to protect their economic interests. And I think those moves by Beijing to create these links are really emblematic of the fact that the more of these major Chinese infrastructure investments that are put in place in the Bay of Bengal region, the greater stake China has in maintaining political stability and over domestic politics. And so, for example, and it's certainly not impossible that we could see a Chinese security presence growing in some of these places, just as we are starting to see a Chinese security presence developing in Pakistan, justified by the need to protect Chinese workers working on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Similar imperatives will be at play in the Bay of Bengal, particularly in Myanmar. Obviously, it's something that the Myanmar government will resist, but it's certainly not impossible that we could see a growing presence, at least in some of these, some states in Myanmar of some nature. I'm not necessarily talking about an overt PLA presence, but it can be manifested in a number of less politically sensitive ways. So where does this lead us? It's difficult to draw too hard and fast conclusions out of these trends, some of which are contradictory, but the overall picture points to a significant increase in the significance of the Bay of Bengal region in economic and strategic terms. Strategic competition between external powers such as China and Japan, along with India, has the potential to inflame existing tensions within the region. But at the same time, we're seeing the potential for economic takeoff by some of these countries, and perhaps moves towards a democratisation and political stability in some as well. So, as I said, these trends sometimes are somewhat contradictory, but they, in my view, they point to a much greater strategic significance of this region than as compared with what we've seen over the past 60, 70 years or the like. So I'll leave it there, Cinder.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much. What I'll do now is just open the floor. I've got a couple of questions, but I think I just hold back first, let the floor ask any questions, and then we can take it from there. Any questions, Suryaji?
How long do you think this kind of abstinence or restraint on the part of the US will hold? And when do you think the US will jump into the fray? Thank you.
I think they don't have any great desire to jump into the fray, if you like. They've got a lot of fires burning in different places, different theatres throughout the world. The Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, and South China Sea. They don't really have any desire to add another one to that list. I think they also are happy to see India being the predominant power in the Bay of Bengal, provided that they actually do a reasonable job of it. The US were happy to see India's role in encouraging the departure of Rajapaksa. That was a good result for everyone. We'll obviously have to see how Myanmar and Bangladesh play out. There are some Indian grumblings about the US hedging its bets in Bangladesh, but I think that is an entirely reasonable thing for the United States to do. The Indians have really put all their eggs in one basket in Bangladesh, and they're going to be really in a lot of trouble if that basket falls over. So I don't, in military terms, I don't see certainly any desire by the United States to create any greater military presence than it has at the moment, and it would prefer for the US to see for the Indians to really take the charge in that. I mean, if you compare, I'm sorry, I actually brought the wrong slides today, but if you compare the Bay of Bengal with the Arabian Sea on the other side of India, the US clearly has a predominant role in the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. And I think the Indians are more or less happy to leave that for the US to look after. By the same token, I think that the US would like to see the Indians building up their presence in the Bay of Bengal, which they are. Vizag has now become the biggest fleet and naval base in India. It's going to have the home of the aircraft carriers, the nuclear submarines, and so certainly India is conducting its own naval rebalance from the west to the east now, and I think the US are quite happy to see that happen.
You didn't touch too much on Thailand. I mean, there's been many times in the past that we talk of developing a seaport or a port on the west coast of Thailand. And the Koreans have been very interested in it more because it helps bypass the Malacca Straits bottleneck, and that has always been the mind of Koreans, sometimes the Japanese.
Well, the Dawei port has been talked about for a long time, and as far as I understand, it's really, at the moment, it's in go-ahead phase as the western terminus of the Indo-China economic corridor, crossing right from Vietnam across to Thailand. And I'm sorry, again, I don't have the right slide here, but the Japanese see this as a single economic corridor running from Vietnam all the way to Chennai, with Dawei as just one, terminus. So then it'll be carried by sea. So, as far as the Japanese are concerned, I don't know about the Koreans. As far as the Japanese are concerned, Dawei is in go-ahead mode, and that will connect to the new Japanese port near Chittagong, and I suspect that the Japanese are closely having a look at how they can develop a port presence at Trinco. That would make a lot of sense, obviously in conjunction with the Indians.
Could the Japanese be ready to do that, given the fact that the Chinese have like down huge investment right at the
The Japanese are keen to go head to head with any Chinese presence in the region. That's certainly not going to hold them back. So, they're also aware that I think ports like Hambantota are just white elephants, and from one perspective, they're quite happy if they want to waste money on something like that. So the Japanese will be much more driven by economics and things making economic sense. But to my mind, this is a personal view, Trinco, if the north of Sri Lanka can be, recover from the war, then Trinco would be an obvious place for a Japanese developed port.
I think maybe I used the prerogative of the chair to ask you two questions. Following up on the Thailand question, can you give us an update about the Isthmus of Kra? A lot of speculation, but very little stuff that you really get, in terms of what's really happening. So maybe you can give us an update. I mean, I hear some Indian rumors about being really concerned about the Isthmus of Kra. That's one. Number two is, you talk about how the strategic competition that happens and how obviously the Chinese are not going to let the Indians just get away with preponderance in the Bay of Bengal. Or let's say even here the Bay of Bengal. In return, you say the Indians are trying to spread their influence in, say, Malacca Straits, South China Sea. What exactly are the Indian plans for South China Sea? I mean, besides selling a couple of arms to Vietnam, joint exploration, beyond that, what do the Indonesians think? Are they on the same side? Or just trying to push the ASEAN thing a bit?
Okay, well, starting with Kra, I think, as far as I'm aware, that's really on hold. It makes absolutely
no sense.
No economic sense. It's can't, no economic justification.
That's the
for
south
it.
of Thailand as well, right? There's
Yeah.
there's the Patani area, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I don't know actually how much concerns about political instability feed into that, but certainly there's no economic case for it, and I don't, as far as, although you see it occasionally mentioned in the press, I don't think there's any push to actually do anything about it. Look, you see Indian commentators sometimes pressing alarm bells about it. I think that's just more on the paranoid, the paranoid end of the world. India, yes, India does want to be a player in the Malacca Strait and a much bigger player in the Malacca Strait and South China Sea. This, I mean, the South China Sea is really largely confined to rhetoric. Indian commentators will constantly remind you that the Indian oil and gas company has a couple of exploration blocks. Well, who cares? Really?
True.
They're exploration blocks with no prospects. The Indian oil company does not want to be there. They've been pushed to be there by the combined force of the Vietnamese and Indian governments. Really intended to be a signal that India is a player in the South China Sea. But the reality is far different, and the Indian Navy doesn't have the capability to project power that far, despite being offered use of the Vietnamese offered the Indian Navy use of the port of Nha Trang 2 or 3 or several years ago, and again, despite a lot of media hype about it, the Indian Navy said, well, thanks, but no thanks. And the reality is, as I think former Indian Chief of Staff Arun Prakash, or was it, it might have been Prakash or another, or it might have been Mehta, said the South China Sea is the last place that India would want to provoke any confrontation with China. It's in strategic terms, it represents external lines for India, internal lines for China. It's really sort of at the outer reaches of the Indian Navy's capabilities. So they certainly don't want to provoke anything. I don't think the Chinese take the Indians seriously in the South China Sea. They might be taken a little bit more seriously if the Indians actually stopped talking and sold BrahMos missiles to the Vietnamese. They've been talking about that for 15 years or so. Nothing has ever happened, and they re-announce the sale. Every time a Vietnamese Prime Minister visits Delhi, they re-announce the sale. It never actually happens. So I'm not sure why the sales never happened. They were blaming the Russians for a while, but that sort of seemed to have gone away. I just think it probably reflects, Indian caution about not wanting to poke the Chinese in the eye too much. Probably, but there may be other reasons. Malacca Strait is, I suppose, a slightly... Now, that being said, I think the Southeast Asian countries would like to see India as another voice at the table saying, talking about freedom of navigation and the like, but I don't think they would be in any way...
Militarily,
Yeah.
no military expectations.
No, I don't think so. Malacca Strait, as we know, Indians have been trying for some time, maybe 15 years, to take some sort of role in the Malacca Strait, which has been largely resisted by the Malaysians and the Indonesians less so. Perhaps if there is some new crisis affecting the Malacca Strait that the littoral states are unable to properly respond to, that might be
They might push Malaysia, Indonesia a
reason
bit.
to take a greater presence, but I don't see anything developing under the current circumstances.
Rajiv?
Just wanted to comment on South China Sea, how India, Vietnam, and Japan are collaborating in South China Sea. You are right that there won't be military confrontation, but on BrahMos, Vietnamese scholar, I had spoken to a couple of Vietnamese scholar, and They say that now Vietnam is not that much interested in BrahMos. They are getting cheaper missiles from Russia, but they are more interested with India and Japan in training of submarine and all those technological part, and then intelligence and surveillance gathering. So there is an agreement between Japan, Vietnam, and India, trilateral agreement. And also they are more interested to strengthen their ground forces. And on that, perhaps US, India, and Vietnam are doing so. A lot of trilateral cooperation are happening, which may not be reported so much in press because there is no military or hot thing. So for that reason, could
Yeah.
be. On BCIM, I think India is cautious, but India is also gradually taking steps to further improve or move on that connectivity part. In last 1 year or so, there is a lot of business delegation coming in both the directions from Yunnan province and from the western part of China to India, and the other way also. And India, Bangladesh also have now understanding about transit. So things are moving slowly, but there are likelihood that the connectivity will improve in the eastern part of this BCIM corridor. MSR is still, India is not open to go on board of that project.
Yeah, I mean, the BCIM, there's different, I suppose, motivations in that India obviously wants transit across Bangladesh to its northeastern states to really economically develop the northeastern states before opening up the next leg from China, whereas Myanmar and Bangladesh have different motivations to want to see opening up to China, and that is sort of one of the big reasons for it being much slower than it could otherwise be. I mean, look, Vietnam, I agree that there is a lot of cooperation and nice feelings, but in terms of India being a significant player, it's not. You know, the reality is that Vietnam wants to have a lot of major players involved in the South China Sea, because to sort of internationalise the issue, if you like. And so from Vietnam, the key players are going to be the United States, Russia, and Japan, and India is a fair way behind that.
I mean,
Thanks, David. Thanks, Inder. David, I was just trying to get a broader view of the region that you are specifically focusing on, the Bay of Bengal. And if we go by this very interesting sort of sea route and shipping traffic that you show us, we see Bay of Bengal expanding into the Indian Ocean, and then on your left you get the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and on the right you get the Indian Ocean further, and then you move on to the Pacific. I suppose we all accept the fact that the way the regional dynamics is going to play out in Bay of Bengal is going to be an interplay of the larger dynamics and the various issues that are taking place in other parts of the world. Now, from an Indian perspective, and also from a regional littoral state perspective, I'm not a security expert, but to me, the development in Japan has been extremely significant. The fact that Japan has moved onto a different constitution altogether. How do you see that impacting the regional state of play? I mean, this is of course something that is probably largely conjectural at this point in time. But to me, I think this is a little bit of a source of concern, and I'll tell you why. I think this probably reflects a kind of a thinking, surely in the Japanese scheme of things, as well as in the Japanese alliance partner scheme of things, principally the US, that the US-Japan influence in the region is probably not it was before. So as a result of that, it becomes Japan to do what it has. And I'm not too sure whether this means very well for the region in a number of respects. And I'm not too sure whether even a country like India, much as it has good relations with Japan, of course now even better relations with the US. Even for India, I'm not too sure whether this, in terms of the micro and the macro regional dynamics, means a very good thing. So do you see that affecting the larger scheme of things and the Bay of Bengal region in any way?
Yeah, look, I'll try and make a few points in response to that. I think Japanese growing interest in the Bay of Bengal area is certainly not pushed from Washington. Washington is like, you go and talk to Washington about Bay of Bengal, it's like, well, where's that? It's like, they've got so many other fish to fry that this is way down, whether the Chinese want to build a port somewhere or other, they so don't care. So it's the growing Japanese role and interest in the Bay of Bengal is coming from Tokyo. That's point number one. I don't necessarily agree with you in terms of the Indians not seeing it as a good thing. I think that the Indians are very much aware of their own economic constraints in terms of matching Chinese projects, if you like, and also obviously their historical baggage in the region, which makes it difficult, or again constrains what India can actually achieve in terms of its relationships with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Myanmar. It's all, there's this historical baggage. And I think there's a view that the Japanese are a benign partner, and if the Japanese can build a port at Chittagong instead of to China, then that's great news for India. I don't see the Indians as having any real concerns on that front. In terms of the change in interpretation of the Japanese constitution, yes, I think it's an important symbolic event, not a really much practical event. Of an important practical change is that Japanese have changed their foreign aid guidelines to include military assistance within the ambit of Japanese overseas development assistance. To me, that's which is sort of, that change has largely slipped under the radar, and I think that's the big one. So it opens the door for Japan to be involved in all sorts of capacity building with Bay of Bengal states. We've seen it obviously with Vietnam and Philippines in South China Sea, provision of patrol boats and the like. It certainly opens the door for much greater involvement in capacity building, and I suppose there is a view to that, to the extent that these countries can get this nice kit from Japan, they won't have to go with their begging bowls to China to ask for equipment. So again, I think that would be seen in positive terms by Delhi. I mean, you can obviously construct scenarios where perhaps there could be concerns by New Delhi about Japan in the Bay of Bengal, but I think they're a long way away from those at the moment.
If you will, to borrow a marketplace terminology, the Chinese have an irrational exuberance about fixing Japan, and also anything to do with Taiwan. That's of course a different issue. So if Japan is going to get involved in Bay of Bengal in some way, economic or call it potentially strategic, don't you think the Chinese would be chasing the Japanese into the Bay of Bengal? And if so, what are the Chinese game plans from your perspective? Especially if the US is not going to be around in the Bay of Bengal, and India is certainly not in the superpower league to take on China on its own.
Look, I think that the first point is that the Chinese interests in the Bay of Bengal are by far economic, and security is sort of really follows on. You know, the flag is following trade very much, and you know they have clear interests in developing these links into the Bay of Bengal, and as I said, developing these states as low-cost manufacturing zones for China. So I think that by far is the predominant issue. I mean, I think we should also take note that China is and will remain highly strategically vulnerable in the whole of the Indian Ocean region, and any military presence that it may develop in the Indian Ocean will be relatively token and in no way has it got a capacity to threaten the US or India in terms of predominance, not for many decades to come. So yes, you know, I think the Chinese, as I said, are primarily economically driven. They'll also be opportunistic. So, for example, when their links with the Rajapaksa regime in Sri Lanka got very close, they were opportunistically thinking, well, let's see if we can take some steps. But, you know, a Chinese submarine visit to Colombo, really? That's not a big, you know, in the scheme of things, that's a pretty minor thing. And, you know, obviously India reacted very strongly to that, but from an objective standpoint, the Chinese presence was just was very tokenistic, and the Indian reaction was very big. So I think we have to, in all of the rhetoric that we see from many, particularly in the Indian commentariat, I think you have to take a bit of a step back and look at, any Chinese involvement is, I mean, yes, they are equipment suppliers to many of these countries, but why? Because their equipment is about a third of the price of Western equipment. So if you were in the Bangladeshi Navy or the Myanmar Navy, of course it makes sense for you to buy stuff from China, even though it's inferior. But, in the reality of any Chinese military presence is another thing, actually very low.
Anything? I got just one more follow-up. Sorry, when you go to Delhi, you keep when you're in Southeast Asia, you keep hearing, the narrative. The Indians don't do enough. The Indians don't step up to the plate. We're waiting for the Indians, etc., etc. But when you go to Delhi, you hear the other narrative. The one narrative they say is that the notion of a unified ASEAN is disappearing, right? What's our benchmark, right? The Indians say, you come and tell us we're not doing enough. Enough for whom, right? And when you talk about the Indochina countries, what China has managed to do is to pick out the low-hanging fruit. Cambodia and Laos, easy, right? Pick them out. And in the problem with the ASEAN issue here is that you just need to pick one person out. And you don't need a majority. You just need to make sure one person doesn't agree, and then the ASEAN consensus is gone. Given that's the situation, what would be, and this now I'm not talking about India, just China and the South China Sea, and I'm pushing you a bit away from the topic, but since you're here, I thought just make use of the opportunity. How do you see this thing evolving? The ASEAN stand, the consensus on the code of conduct, the sea code of conduct, etc. So going forward, the Laos and Cambodia issue, what can ASEAN do, you think? Is it a gone case? Because I hear some ASEAN diplomats, especially Singaporean ones, just despair and say, that's it, it's finished.
Yeah.
You think they can bring them back?
Well, let me start from India's perspective. I mean,
Yep.
as you know, ASEAN centrality, India has been a very strong supporter
Yes.
of ASEAN
Centrality,
centrality.
yep.
It's seen it as, for a number of reasons, it wants to be working through ASEAN, etc. I do think there is a growing recognition in Delhi that that's not going to be necessarily a viable long-term plan, at least in the whole. And I think the Indians will have to be picking partners in Southeast Asia, and it's the obvious ones are Singapore and Vietnam. They have this vision, a way too optimistic vision that somehow or other that the Indonesians will realise that they're actually natural strategic partners. And there's a lot of fooling themselves going into that, and I don't think that view is reciprocated at really much, if at all, from the Indonesian side. So, in picking strategic partners in Southeast Asia, I struggle to see any sort of natural partners, if you like, beyond Singapore and Vietnam. Who else?
Why isn't the thing with the Philippines working out, though? You should think that, both a bit...
Yeah, look, it's quite funny. When I was I was working in Mumbai in 2013, a big delegation of Filipino Navy people came through to visit the Western Fleet. And the Indian Navy guys were going, "We've never seen one Filipino here in the last 50 years." And suddenly this big delegation turns up. And it has an air of desperation about it. Right?
Oh, yes, of course.
And I'm sure the Indians are quite happy to give out all the rhetoric of yes and partners and all that sort of stuff, but are they willing or able to actually provide anything of use to the Filipinos? I don't think so. The Filipinos are naturally going to be getting their support from the US and Japan, right? So, yes, look, I think to the extent your overall question is sort of where the breakdown of ASEAN as a coherent grouping, or the gradual breakdown, where does that leave India? It's a very good question. I don't know where it leaves. There's no other. What other natural partners? Are there any other natural partners you could point to in the region? I don't. It's not clear.
Australia, maybe. Yeah.
Well, Australia.
yeah. Any other questions? No? Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, David, as usual. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. I think there's coffee and tea outside, right, Yusuf? Yeah. Semblance of coffee and tea. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thanks, David.